Chapter 23, Section 3, Divisions in Democracy in France. How did the Dreyfus Affair impact later events? Analyze the impact of the Dreyfus Affair. And you don't have to worry about other challenges to the Third Republic. So I picked out this for a very specific reason, is that post World War II, the things that happen here and the ideas that are generated from this affair are going to impact the way the world views the way to solve the Jewish situation in Europe, especially after what happens with Hitler and the Holocaust. And so what this does is this illustrates the problems that exist in Europe and continue to exist, to be quite honest, to this day. So anti-Semitism and the Dreyfus Affair. So anti-Semitism is anti-Judaism. So it's being discriminatory against Jewish people. Dreyfus is a high-ranking army officer, and he's accused of spying for Germany. And what ends up happening is he gets denied access to evidence, as does his lawyer. So when he goes to trial, he doesn't have the ability, nor does his lawyer, to see the evidence that is against him. And really what it comes down to is it's because he's Jewish. And there's a number of officers who resent the fact that he was promoted to this position because they didn't feel a Jewish person should be able to do that. And the press views him as a traitor. When you look at this, it doesn't create, the deep divisions are already there. But this particular event crystallizes those divisions and it causes a greater divide. So one of the things that comes out of this is there's a number of supporters and a novelist who rally to Dreyfus's cause. And what eventually happens is, because of the work of these supporters and the novelists, is this gets exposed as really, to be honest with you, a fraud, that this whole series of charges were trumped up. There was no real evidence, and the charges are dropped and honors are restored. The message that many Jewish people get from this is that they're never going to have political and social power within these countries in Europe. And so you start to hear a call for a Jewish state. And the Theodor Herzl is the first one to start this call for a Jewish country known as Zionism. When we look at the anti-Semites, they're typically lower class individuals who weren't doing well for themselves. They were insecure about their future. And so there's a call to exclude people from all different walks of life, to exclude people with different religious beliefs, and to exclude people from other places. And so it's kind of interesting a little bit to see this reemerging in Europe today, where you have a whole group of young people who lack access to opportunity, and the answer to that is to become exclusionary. And to some extent, that there's a strain of that running in the United States a little bit too. So what comes out of this is there's this push for Zionism. It's kind of debated and thrown around between different countries in Europe, and then it's largely ignored, especially as other problems become more pressing. And then after World War II and the Holocaust and the genocide, Europe decides that enough is enough and something needs to be done. Here's the problem, is that they're going to create a country, Israel, in a place that's known as Palestine, that are populated by Palestinians. And so now you're creating a homeland someplace that somebody already calls home. So the closest thing I can do to explain this would be if all of a sudden the United States decided that the way that they had treated Native Americans was totally wrong. And what we'll do is we'll give them the entire state of Iowa, and all Iowans are forced to leave their homes, and Native Americans can come in and take over. That would cause some pretty serious problems, and that's what happened with Israel. So we'll go right into Section 4, expansion of the U.S. How did the U.S. develop during the 1800s? Territory, democracy grew, and the impact of economic growth and social reform in the United States. So if we look at territorial expansion, Napoleon again plays a part here because of his little screw up and his little mishap and the revolution that took place in Haiti, he decides to sell France's holdings in what is to become the United States to the United States in the Louisiana Purchase. And what it does is it makes the size of the United States grow by 2/3, I think, is what it ended up doing. So it's a huge amount of territory, and sooner or later people are going to move westward. One of the themes, and this is really going to be important for next year, is this idea of manifest destiny. And so this painting is entitled Manifest Destiny, that Lady Republic is heading west. And what it's doing is it's bringing light and progress with it, and it's driving out the savages and the darkness. And the idea of manifest destiny is that God gave Americans a special destiny on earth, and that we are meant to spread from sea to shining sea. And many Americans would even think that it means that sooner or later Canada, Mexico, and South America are going to become part of the United States. Expanding democracy, Jacksonian democracy, what ends up happening is as the United States spreads westward, sooner or later you get states that have people who don't make or meet the voting qualifications. So out east, you needed to be a wealthy, land-holding, white male to be able to vote. Well, the problem is places like Tennessee and Kentucky and Ohio and Illinois become states, they don't have wealthy men. What they have is they have relatively modest farmers who don't meet the voting eligibility out east. So what these new states do is they say all adult white men who pay some form of a tax are eligible to vote. That changes the dynamic, and Andrew Jackson is the first one to recognize that, and he appeals to the common man, and he becomes the first non-founding father or president tied to the founding fathers, and it changes American politics. At the same time, you see calls for abolition, so they're watching what's happening in Great Britain. And so William Lloyd Garrison, who writes a paper called The Liberator, and Frederick Douglass, who is an African-American, escaped African-American slave, those two become two of the key voices in the call for abolition. And at the same time, women are also pushing for rights. So you've got Mott and Stanton and the Seneca Falls Convention, who are all pushing to expand the right to vote to women. For the Civil War, when we look at the causes, and again, we'll go into more detail next year, there's geographic, economic, and social issues that really make the South very different from the North. And then you throw in there the issue on the expansion of slavery. Northern states don't want it to expand for a couple of different reasons. One is they're expanding their factories and they don't want to rely on slave labor because they just see that as being almost too expensive, and they don't see it being very profitable. So they don't think businesses are going to continue to grow and expand if slavery is the way that they find their workers. The other thing is when you look at the political system, is there's an even number of slave states and free states. So every new state, it threatens to upset the political balance. So if all of a sudden the southern states have one more state on their side with slavery, they're able to outvote the North in the Senate. And so this is going to cause a lot of controversy. When we look at North versus South, the thing that really puts things over the edge is Lincoln's election. And when you look at this electoral or this map, it doesn't seem that bad until you look at the actual vote. President Lincoln only got 40% of the vote, but he got 60% of the Electoral College. So 6 out of 10 Americans voted for somebody else, and Lincoln easily became president of the United States. As a matter of fact, all these states in green didn't even list Lincoln on the ballot. He got 0 votes in all of these states, and he still easily became president. And that's the thing that really sets the South and puts it over the edge. When we look at for challenges for African Americans, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. The important thing to realize, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free all slaves. It only freed slaves in Confederate-held territory. So it really only freed the slaves in the South. It didn't free any slaves in the middle states or the northern states. because Lincoln didn't want to go too far and he didn't want to agitate too many people. The system that takes place post-Civil War is called Jim Crow South. Jim Crow is a minstrel character, but the Jim Crow laws are the things that led to segregation, white only restrooms and drinking fountains, and in this case, the ability of only whites to buy Coca-Cola from this vending machine. So if we look at economic growth, social reform, the key here is that the United States has political stability, it has strong private property rights, it encourages free enterprise, it has cheap land and labor. And because of those characteristics, it's going to become an industrial superpower in a very short period of time. Once you get the whole issue of the North versus the South, and you get the Civil War out of the way, the United States from really 1870 to 1890, in that 2-decade period of time, just becomes a colossus superpower economically. And sooner or later, we're going to emerge into that in world affairs as well. So if we look at business and labor, so Carnegie and Rockefeller are probably by far the two biggest business owners. Carnegie with his steel, Rockefeller with his oil, they are going to dominate the world. When you look at the labor end of things, low wages, brutal conditions is what allows Carnegie and Rockefeller to get that world domination. And so we're setting the United States up for that struggle that we've already talked about in other places. Reformers, it starts with populists, the farmers. A lot of their ideas are going to influence later events. They call for an 8-hour workday. They call for women's right to vote. They call for lots of political reforms. And so they're reacting to the fact that the United States is becoming more urban and more industrial, and the farmer is losing political and economic power, and they're trying to hold on to that for as long as they can. What grows out of the populist movement are the progressives, and these are the groups of people that's really going to reform the United States. Reformers tended to come from big cities, and they're reacting to the problems of urbanization and industrialization. So these are things we'll talk a lot more about next year in U.S. history.